So I'm going to be talking about some principles for change management, but it's all under the sort of label of Eco2 cities, ecological cities as economic cities, which is the name of the book I've recently written for the World Bank, and also what's emerging as a program or community of practice around sort of sustainability for cities, and particularly in East Asia now, but the book has received quite a bit of attention in other locations as well. My plan is to introduce you to some of the context very quickly, much of which I'm sure you're familiar with. It'll just warm me up anyways, and then I'm going to describe the principles quickly. I'm going to elaborate on a couple of things that are different and maybe new to you, and finally I want to talk about how these things get applied on the ground. Does that make sense? So the context is the urban era in which we live and the phenomenal and accelerating pace of change that's affecting everything about our lives. I think if it's climate action, remember that over 3/4 of all greenhouse gas emissions are generated by or for cities. There is absolutely no solution to climate action without a transformation of cities, including a transition in how we provide services to those cities. And because it's the urban era, we're also seeing cities, changing the entire political economy. They are now the engines of growth. A country can't succeed unless its cities succeed. Cities are becoming a high priority everywhere I go. Their GDP is often a majority of the total for a country, and in fact, many cities have a higher gross product than many countries. So it's a different world we live in, and I know there are other things, demographics, globalization, climate change, all kinds of things you could use to define our era, but none of them comes close as a nexus to the fact that the entire human population is moving into large cities, and they're all moving lockstep with certain kinds of technology, and that these cities are about to explode in size. Really, what we've got is essentially in about 25 years, give or take, we're going to double the urban population and triple the urban footprint. That's not a lot of time. And right now, a lot of decisions are being cast in concrete, and we'll live with them for many generations. And so it's really an opportunity, but very much a crisis at the same time for what we're going to do. I've written here, we're building a whole new world. The cities we have now took thousands of years to be created. Now, there's leaps and starts, and the Industrial Revolution took 100 years here and there, and it's still going on. But to think about creating all of that again in as short a time period as 25 years is a shock, really, and especially a challenge for anyone trying to manage that. You can see the pace of growth in Asia, Africa, and Latin America here, how really rural populations are declining rapidly, urban populations increasing rapidly. And really, I think it's not an overstatement, but the entire challenge right now is how we go about planning and designing and managing our cities. In fact, I'd say we are going to spend the rest of our professional lives grappling with that issue, whether you're doing it in a developed country or developing. If you're in a developed country, you have privilege and opportunity to help experiment, set new patterns. Right now, much of the development I'm dealing with in developing world is just a carbon copy, often designed by the same engineering companies, for goodness sakes. And the World Bank, that has helped me so much in publishing my work, are to a large extent responsible for that, massive replication and reproduction of what is largely unsustainable development patterns. Here I've got Mike Davis quoted talking about what an incredible disaster we're heading for with so much coming together at once. Peak oil, climate change, population growth, the massive explosion of cities all over the world, and coming shortages in all kinds of resources, water, soil, food, and so forth. I would say it differently than Mike Davis, but he's very good at sensationalizing these things. But can you sensationalize something that is so big and such a crisis and that means so much to humanity? I'm not sure. So that, obviously leads to the question of what are we to do and what can we do? I think, of course, especially where I work, everyone is more than aware of the many challenges to managing change in cities. I've listed some of the biggest ones here. I won't go through the list, you can read it if you want, but I think what you'll recognize is that most of the challenges are institutional. We get in our own way, and really, I think we know enough about where to go. We have many survivor cities in Europe that are extremely sustainable and excellent templates. The technology is already there, and so is the economics for that matter. What's lacking, of course, are the institutional structures and processes for actually managing the big transformation. At the same time, we've got a whole lot of new finance, at least promised, you know. It's still a fraction of what's needed, but everyone recognizes now too that multilateral development banks and other groups are only going to help leverage what's going to be a massive transfer of funds from the developed world to the developing world over the next couple of decades in the order of trillions of dollars a year, which is hard to fathom, I know, but it's still a vast transfer of funds in a desperate attempt to address all kinds of problems, the Millennium Goals, and of course climate change. At the same time, we're just at the beginning of the urban era. We're going to have a massive explosion of slums all over the world, despite what we do, and then we'll have to deal with how to transition all those informal settlements and service them, connect them to the modern world and to networked infrastructure. These are huge challenges. I don't know if the money is anywhere near enough, given the institutional problems that we face. So that brings me to this book, which is now a World Bank bestseller, and which is being taken up as a blueprint for how to manage change in a number of countries now. And I guess I'm in that position where Tim was describing this morning about these phenomenal and spectacular failures. I think people are actually trying to do what I'm suggesting in the book, and I think the limits to my own knowledge and experience are going to be exposed for sure. I'm in the process of just finishing a sequel to the book on how to implement all of this in a step-by-step manner, and it's been extremely difficult to do. What you see here is kind of the concept of Eco2 unbundled. If you start with this pyramid and flip it up, at its core you have a concept, ecological cities as economic cities. And then flowing out from that, you have a set of key principles, some methods and tools that are not being used a lot, a pathway or process for developing change, and a whole community of practice, which is starting to form city networks and so forth. I'd like to talk about those briefly. Here they are listed in detail. There's 4 key principles, and I'm going to go through them. The methods I won't have time to talk about, except for the integrated design process, but there's a whole set of methods that are available and simple to use. Free software, for example, to do life cycle assessment, or life cycle costing at least, of any residential development or any energy infrastructure. These programs are easy to use, and anybody who's been through college can learn to use them in a few hours, but they're not being used anywhere. In fact, in most places you don't get cost-benefit analysis or sensitivity studies. You have no look at the profitability long-term or at the risk management issues. Development is just going headlong. The pathway is this implementation process I'll briefly introduce, and the city networks I think are absolutely key. In fact, learning from each other is what it's all about. I remember that old phrase, the learning society, from Illich and others in the late 60s, when suddenly people found they had more time on their hands and might even have 2 careers in their life, and technology was changing. Well, now it's really the learning society, and in fact, since we mostly are living in cities, it's the learning city, and it requires that you absolutely learn from other people's successes and failures. We can't afford to do it any other way. So setting up those networks is key. Let me go to the core concept, ecological city as economic city. What am I talking about? Well, I think probably here you understand what an ecological city is, some place that preserves its ecological assets, so the stream of services from those assets is preserved over time, and does it in a way that has many, many co-benefits in terms of livability and resiliency and so forth. An economic city, of course, provides opportunities for meaningful work and helps allocate scarce resources and build surpluses for hard times. And I think develops the green economy through green procurement and all the rest of that. I think the key thing here is there's a fusion now happening, and everywhere we go, people lock onto it, just like that. That you cannot attract footloose industry and professionals today unless you have clean air, safe streets, places for children, and so forth. It's not an option here that you can afford after you're wealthy. To compete in a global economy, you have to have good urban planning. In fact, it's one of your basic strategies to success. You can no longer ignore that. And so, you can't have economic prosperity without good, solid urban design, and it flips the other way. If you don't have an economy that's working well, you have deterioration socially and physically in a city, and it's just like a disease. And even if it's one or two neighborhoods, it spreads, and it's a huge problem. So these two things are artificially and arbitrarily divided, when in fact, when you work with them together, there's huge positive synergies, and it's all about capturing those synergies. That's how we make it all affordable. I think so you get a kind of fusion. The other thing I just mentioned is Eco2. The exponent is about all the extra co-benefits that come from really bridging the artificial divide. But for a long time, we've had eco-cities, and they've mostly been cities that just do something like an improved waterfront, de-streeting, a wastewater treatment plant that's advanced or something. That shopping cart approach to green technology no longer defines an eco-city. A second generation of eco-cities is emerging, which takes a much more systemic look, looks at the entire flows of energy, water, materials through the urban system, from nature to nature, and doesn't play games or greenwash because it's taking that holistic perspective. That second generation is also what we mean by an Eco2 city. There's some strategies I want to introduce to you now, which are basically called principles, just because they're super strategies. So a principle is always just a strategy. These are super strategies. Why? Because they're really, really important to success, because they're largely ignored and they're universally applicable. Now, how do we know that? Well, when we started writing the book with a team there at the World Bank, we looked at the best case examples around the world, and we had cities like Stockholm and Curitiba and Vancouver and Brisbane and Auckland and so forth working really closely with us, and we made sure that we were actually basing our principles on the proven experience of cities that had achieved success in particular areas. Now, no city's done it all, but each of those cities I mentioned has a particular area of specialty. The one I'm from, Vancouver, has some phenomenal success in designing downtown areas and land use planning, for example. I know that extremely well, and I think lots of cities indeed could learn from its success in that area. It's failing in many other areas. So we established, based on proven success, 4 key principles, and the first one of those is a city-based approach, and I can't go through all this in the time available. You can see the kinds of things I'm talking about, and you probably sort of understand what I mean. The first one, sort of a bottom-up approach to design, is a little different. They're all a little different. They've got edges, and if you want the details, you need the book. You can download it free. But let me just pause and give a footnote. The city-based approach, or bottom-up self-reliance, means that every design solution begins with a design team working at the most local scale possible. It's not a filter down or subsidiarity or sort of a breaking down approach. It's really putting the huge potential for meeting your own needs at the most local level, so that a building, neighborhood, cluster, block is a tremendous opportunity to meet as many needs as possible. Treat the rainwater, capture energy, recycle your waste, cascade and loop the resources as close to home as possible, meet all your own needs. You can work close to home running those things. Infrastructure becomes architectural and beautiful and multi-purpose. You get a lot more diversity in your whole urban area. You develop sense of place and pride. I could go on and on. But usually it's not possible to do it all. So what you can't do, economically and technically, at the most local level, you pass on, like a baton, like a race, okay? And you're in a race, and what you can't do, you pass on, but it's lighter now, because you did a lot. And at the next level, at the neighborhood or city level, you do what you need to and pass on only what's left to the next level up. In this way, by the time you get to the urban region, there's very little infrastructure required. And what you have is a much more nodal, ecological system with much greater functionality at the local scale. That is the model or pattern that we're working with all over and everywhere I go for all systems. So I wanted you to get a sense for how these points, if I had the time, they flesh out. And that's what's in the book, and that's what's based on our experience. And they're actually quite radical here to go to East Asia and talk about top-down support and bottom-up self-reliance. It's extremely political, believe me. I mean, in Malaysia where I'm working, there aren't even elected local governments. You really have to show the top-down support, setting targets, sharing good news, developing flexible infrastructure that can share surpluses, and then letting communities and developers self-organize. It's a whole different model, but it still creates a useful, heroic role for the national and senior governments to play. And of course, I have to work with that in order to help the transition. Moving on to the second principle, an expanded platform for collaboration and decision making. Lots of people are using the term collaboration. I've had a lot of success with formalizing collaboration. It's not often done. It means you're setting in place something that will last over time, not for a specific issue, not to resolve things momentarily. It requires that you get senior statespeople involved to bring people to the table, because they often hate each other or they're competing. And it really has to be a special event. And that's crucial. It's a kind of leadership exercise. But the formal collaboration runs on collaboration rules, and you get everyone to sign in blood, and it requires a period of time to understand those. Let me give you a quick example. Let's say we're about to set up a group, and I say, nobody here is going to give up any power. Budget, staff, nothing. What I'm going to ask you to do is meet regularly, and when and if we do reach consensus on a common strategy, then we agree that we'll each go back to our offices and use our budget and staff and policies to further this common strategy and work together so we're all rowing in the same direction. I'd like you to share information where you can, to try and align your policies when you can. It's a collective effort, and we're all going to benefit hugely if we do it. That's the kind of pep talk, spread over time, clear rules, well-facilitated, well-researched meetings, happen at the senior level and at the middle level, and then break into subsectors to deal with big projects or specific sectors. It's a form of governance that extends absolutely who's involved. And it's a lot more than stakeholder engagement. It's participating in decision-making, and it's helping to correct this shrinking short-termism that's plaguing elected governments all over as they're stuck to making decisions on the 3- and 4-year electoral cycle. The larger collaborative group making important decisions and formalized helps to hold the local governments accountable to decisions made by previous groups, and really provides inertia, a flywheel, and helps to correct one of the biggest problems we're facing. I don't have time to go into more of that here. What I'll do is talk about the third principle. I call it the one system approach. You're all familiar with the importance of systems thinking and integrated design and so forth. We take this quite a bit further. In fact, the book has pages and pages describing the different ways in which things can be integrated. Policies, technologies, sector, which is sector, within sectors as things cascade and so forth. It's a whole language. The most difficult part of it is bringing in the spatial design together with the resource flows. And that's always, it's a policy that's plagued design since design was created in the modern world. And when I'm working with large teams to get the architects working with the engineers and so forth, extremely tricky. You need the right tools to do it so that everyone can use the same tools. I have a lot of tools buried under this to make it, but you have to create a platform that allows people to develop together forecasts and do it in a way that they understand the spatial implications and the flows. Really what you've got is a whole series of flows that are non-spatial coming through the city, of course. That's what's called material flow analysis. But it creates those Sankey diagrams with the noodles and going. They're incredibly powerful. I can't do design without them now anymore. It's fantastic what you can learn from those and start to loop them and cascade them and shrink the ones that are too big. And then as you do that, you get way more value out of any resource flow. And the middle, the demand area starts to use more water, use more materials. Go ahead. You shrink how much you're taking from nature, and you shrink, of course, how much goes back in emissions. That's the actual ecological design process for these non-spatial flows. It's interesting how the way the resource flows interact with the spatial design in so many ways. That's smart growth, right? So you don't have to travel so much and don't create the emissions, but many other ways of layering. Let me give you a few little examples to flesh this out so you know what I'm talking about. What happened here? I'm waving my hands and turning the slides, I think. Okay, so the fourth principle just is an investment framework that, of course, looks at sustainability issues and resiliency and somehow does a multi-criteria analysis on every project and every plan. And if we don't have some kind of tool for that, even the simplest tool is better than no tool at all. And you can't sum it all up in monetary units. It simply doesn't work for anybody. And what you want to ensure is a minimum performance in each area. Ideally, what you want to do is work with the standard accounting procedures that cities already have, and they have their capital investment plans, and they all figure out what their assets are, every city in the world. So work with asset accounting, but just add some additional columns, right? And that's where you get into the 4 capitals or 5 capitals approach. It's very powerful, and you can start with just 1 or 2 indicators in each column and then flesh it out over time. But what you're giving people is a really nice toolkit for understanding the full costs of any particular project, you know, direct, contingent, and indirect, and those costs over time, depending on how you choose your indicators. So manufactured capital is your built environment. We already know that well. And you know, GDP is an example of an indicator. But you go on to look at, you know, all the other capitals, human capital, social capital, and so forth. So I wanted to just give you a flavor here of the new pattern language for resource flows through cities. Cascading and looping are a key. Here's water cascading, and the example of Singapore, which I know very well and which we're one of the cities helping us. Phenomenal what they're doing with water flows there, almost going too far, I think. The same with power and energy. It's a big part of the climate change action strategies is to actually match the quality of the energy to the requirements of the end use. It's insane using electricity for, you know, lighting if you can do it with daylighting, or for using for things like heating or cooling when you can do that with much lower quality energy sources. Ultimately, what you do with a city, and I've done this in places it's fabulous, is you start designing with energy. You get exergy chains, often running along your transportation corridors, starting with your very hot industry and cascading the thermal energy over the landscape. And where you don't have lots of energy sources, no windy sites, no biomass, no low-level aquifers, no sunshine or whatever, those are the quiet spots for people who like to live alone, and you spread things out and change your density. And so really, we're going back to much more ecological kinds of design on the landscape as we apply these simple patterns. This is the Stockholm example. I think I mentioned how there's a big change in, you know, from what you see here. It could be, it doesn't matter, waste, water, energy, health care, education, or computers. It's all the same thing. You're going from remote, huge, single-purpose, one-way, expensive and oversized and inflexible systems that go direct to single-purpose end uses, to a much more networked, where you pick up and give away and share in a kind of anarchic, self-organizing way, and that where actually you don't know where your internet service provider is located. Why do you care? And they might move next year and it doesn't matter. And the same will go for water treatment and energy generation. It's that kind of evolution that we're trying to encourage. At the same time, in every place where you design, you're making maximum use of your natural resources, and then as a hybrid fashion, adding on. So instead of pushing, pulling, pumping, driving everything, you begin with sunshine and wind and tidal flows and everything else, and then you just add slightly to that as needed or share with your neighbors. And as these networks evolve, they actually break up into networks of networks. So you can see that this 19th century model goes to the 21st century model. We have many different options for what the energy inputs might be. The network is designed automatically for convertibility, extensibility, and adaptability. This is adaptation at the urban scale. Same time, the old ideas from the 19th century of segregating out your industry, your residential, your commercial, your parks, everything gets layered now, and you can't tell one from the other. In fact, when you finish these designs I'm talking about, I'll come to close here. The infrastructure is so embedded in the fabric of the built environment that you cannot separately identify your energy system from your water, from your transportation, from materials management. They all blend together in beautiful ways. If I had more time, I'd give you examples of what that looks like.
Sebastian, I really think...
yeah, we'll go to some questions.